Welcome to A Moment of Bach, where we take our favorite moments from the composer's vast musical output, just a minute's worth or even a few seconds, and show you why we think they are remarkable. We are your hosts, Christian and Alex Giebert, and today is a guest episode with Erich Clausen, who has chosen the Moment of Bach. Today's moment is from the cantata Herz und Mund und Tat und Leben. Well, we're excited to have our first guest on today, Erich Clausen. He is a Lutheran pastor, and moreover, he is our brother-in-law. So, Erich, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Super excited to be here and to be the official first guest of A Moment of Bach.
That's right.
Yeah, super cool. I'll tell my grandchildren about that.
Yeah, it's a momentous occasion for sure, but it is exciting for us. I mean, we sort of pictured this as being a podcast where a lot of different people could come on as guests, whether they are musicians or just people who are involved in maybe church music or church in some way, like you are with being a pastor, or really just anybody who likes the music of Bach in some way. And I think Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring is a great one for that kind of pick. But what do you think, Erich? Why did you pick this one? What do you love so much about it?
Well, I'm definitely not like a real musician, more than just the basic hobby stuff. So I don't really understand like the deep theory that you guys get into. I love hearing you guys explain it, and you explain it to me very well. But I actually don't know, embarrassingly, all that many Bach pieces, just the most simplest. So this is one that I know, but it's one that I always love, and I don't even know exactly why I love it. I guess most people enjoy this. But I was telling you guys earlier, one of the reasons that I love this piece is the absolute delight that I get from it. And
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys are like this, but in church work, a lot of times you don't get to enjoy it. You're so busy, you're thinking about stuff all the time, and you don't get to like be in the moment. But when this song comes on, a lot of times it's the prelude at our church, and it's like when it comes on, then I get to delight. I get to feel it and be like, oh yeah, I am doing this, for delight. And I get to be in God's presence.
Yeah.
And it just, I don't know, it brings me that pretty much every time I hear it. And it brings me back. That's why I love it. I don't know how the music does that to me, but it does.
Yeah,
every time.
Well, just speaking of joy and Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring, right? I'm sure we'll get into like the text in a little bit here. It's not like literally a translation from the German. The literal translation is something closer to Jesus shall remain my joy. But I mean, it's about joy, right? So it makes you feel joyful, and it's also, I'm sure it's like that nostalgia too, because a lot of us have heard this piece for a lot of our life, and associated with really good moments, like being played at weddings and stuff. I mean, I had this at my wedding, we had this as my wife walked down the aisle, played on an acoustic guitar. A lot of people use this as their wedding, probably second to Pachelbel's Canon, which is interestingly a piece of a similar era, right? Just maybe a couple of years, I think a generation before Bach, right? Would you say,
Yeah,
Christian?
I think so.
I think Pachelbel was a generation before Bach. But it's a wedding song, it gets used and it's also Christmas related too. People end up using it at Christmas, even though that's not quite when it was written for. They talk about this in an accompanying interview video with the Netherlands Bach Society's performance of this cantata, and they sort of get into like, why is this so famous? I mean,
yeah.
And it's not really a very clear answer. It's a very subjective question, like why is it so nice? And they go a little bit into how lovely and just like perfectly beautiful that instrumental introduction is. And maybe it's that it has this comforting, lilting quality. It has these notes in groups of three You know, the 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, bump, 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 bump. And actually, this did come up on another episode where we discussed a cantata that had an opening that was pastoral. Yeah, that was episode 12. Yeah, in other words, the pasture. And what Bach was portraying there was a sense of calm and elegance, but also like a rustic outdoorsy sense, but definitely a reference, like a musical reference that everyone would have understood. And this has that same comforting quality. It's utterly smooth and peaceful. And it just goes on, you know, it doesn't, that line just moves on and on and on, and it's very like lulling.
Is this supposed to be a pasture-esque kind of a scene also?
Yeah. I mean, that's the likely guess of like a music historian about this. Yeah, I'm going to agree, because there are a few like musical clues to that. Like there's the fact that it's got groups of 3. There's also just the fact that it's in a particular key. It's in G major. A lot of the pastoral stuff was in G major. I don't think it's as overt of a reference as some of the other stuff we've looked at, and it doesn't mention, the first batch of text doesn't necessarily mention Jesus Christ as the shepherd, I think, but it's still got those themes inherent in it. Jesus loves me and entrusts himself to me. That's why I shall not leave Jesus, even though my heart should break. And Jesus remains my joy, comfort. They loved the metaphor in this time period, the composers and the lyricists, of Christ the shepherd, you know.
Yeah, for sure.
That takes care of you and takes care of his flock. And so his flock of sheep is us. We're the sheep and he's the shepherd.
Makes sense. Still popular. I am Jesus' little lamb. Big hit.
Right. Yeah.
The Lord's my shepherd is another one.
Uh-huh.
It's worth talking a little bit about the format of this work. It's based on a chorale tune that people would have known and that Bach knew, and that is happening when the choir comes in, right? But then that string thing you hear at the beginning of the movement is original by Bach. And that's the part that everybody really loves, I think.
Yeah, I
right?
think so.
That's the famous part, I think. And the chorale is the less famous part, although it's really typical of Bach. It's really like genius how he weaves that in, and how the little triplets will stop, and then it's just 1, 2, 3, 3 beats per measure with the chorale. But then once the choir's done singing, then it goes back to the da 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 da. I mean, you can do whatever. Like, I arranged a thing for this where I switched out that chorale with a different chorale tune, God's Own Child, I Gladly Say It.
Oh, nice.
For my daughter's baptism. And that was really cool. But I used the Bach. Da, 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 da. I used that. So,
because
yeah.
of her name.
Right, because of her name. Yeah, because of her middle name is Joy, so I wanted to use the Joy thing. But then also that God's Own Child is a baptism thing. So yeah. But it's so versatile like that. It's so simple, but it's just so recognizable, I guess.
Okay, so I may be going out on a limb, but you guys did the episode a while back on the well-tuned clavier. What is that one?
Yep.
So that kind of reminds me of just you had that thing going, and then the other guy put the Ave Maria over the top of it.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
I don't know, it just kind of seems similar. You have the, I don't know, instrumental, doing all sorts of stuff, and the voices over top of it.
Yeah, for sure. And that's what Bach did a lot. He took the existing tunes and then he arranged his own material like over it or with it or whatever. Like that was very common of the era.
Yeah, it's not completely unlike a cover of a song where
Is it more like a mashup?
It is more like a
maybe,
mashup.
except for
or like a mashup of one song, but then the other song is your original song.
Got it.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's like a cover in that it's your surrounding material, but someone else's like main musical notes, as if that makes sense.
I think so. You
Yeah.
get sued for that today, though.
Copyright makes things very tricky these days. That's for sure.
Yeah, whereas back in the day, Bach would take something of Vivaldi's and reorchestrate it. It was not against the law to do that without asking Vivaldi or his estate or whatever, whoever owned the copyright, because that did not exist. Copyright did not exist, and it was considered an honor to use somebody else's piece like that. But now we have copyright, which is intended to protect artists, or at least that's the in the ideal world, that's what it is. But like you said, Christian, that is a double-edged sword. You mentioned that in the Brandenburg 3 episode. That's a double-edged sword too.
Yeah, people abuse it sometimes, and there have been some public and infamous lawsuits recently, how some pop singers' lawyers used some legal language to basically abuse that principle and make it less about the music and more about just money.
Yeah, which is a shame. But the good thing is that this little thing by Bach here is in the public domain, so you can use it.
Right. The only thing about music of this time period that's not in the public domain are the recordings themselves. So, but if you you can feel free to make your own cover of this, and that's what people do. People arrange this all the time. Like Alex, you said you had a guitarist at your wedding who did this, and no one's going after him because this music is old enough to be public domain.
Right.
Yeah, I've heard this in pop songs or electronic versions or all these different things, and it's really cool, and I love it. And I remember one time hearing it when I was young, and I was like, oh, this is so cool. What is this? Oh my goodness, it's Bach? What?
Right.
That's crazy. I don't know. I think it's so accessible that it doesn't seem like it was written 300 years ago. It seems comfortable for the modern mind.
Yeah, there really is something special about it.
I think this is the perfect example of why Bach is so eternal and timeless, because this particular piece just shows you how many different directions people go with it today. Now it has an English text that's very different from its original text, but Bach is pliable. His music is flexible and it is very arrangeable. It lends itself to that,
Yeah, there's a famous piano arrangement that is kind of what made this famous. When the piano arrangement by Myra Hess, when that arrangement was made available, that kind of made this movement of this cantata more famous, and that's kind of what launched it into the classical mainstream, you could say. And then now, of course, it's enjoyed a lot of hype in the classical world.
Yeah, because this was not a thing that stands alone. That's something we should mention. This is part of a huge cantata, a cantata which was an early draft of one of Bach's earlier cantatas, and then he later used and made into this one, the Herz und Mund und Tat und Leben cantata. And no one thinks of it as that anymore. No one knows what that is. That they mentioned that in the Netherlands Bach Society interview. No one knows this cantata, even though it's got great other parts too, which is a shame. People only know this famous part, but this is from a larger thing,
But it does seem like Bach knew that this little bit was the best because he did repeat it. It's the thing he repeated.
Uh-huh.
Well,
it's movement
give the people
6.
what they want.
Exactly. It's movement 6 and 10. Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyways, we should talk about the pastor's perspective here with Eric here, because that's kind of a cool part of it. We have to guess at a lot of this, although there's some record of it, but we have to guess a lot of the sort of vibe of the church services back in Bach's day at the Thomaskirche, which is where he was and had just started working when he arranged this cantata the way that it is now. And I know that people came to see the music of Bach in the church sometimes. They were kind of like those people, but then there were also the devout churchgoers that were there for the whole thing with the sermon and the scripture and the communion and all that. A Lutheran church. So, yeah.
Well, I wish I knew more about that time period. The 1700s, at least in the Lutheran church, is not my specialty or my forte. If you ask me about the 1500s or before, I probably know a bit more. But I'm really curious to know, what would have Bach's relationship have been with the pastors of the church? What I wonder, were they annoyed with him that he would stole all their thunder? They're not coming for me; they're coming for this guy. And what that was like, if it was a good relationship or not. I'd like to think that Bach got along well with everybody. At least his music is. I don't know. I feel like he just knows he's so good enough that he's relaxed and he doesn't care. Do we know that much about Bach's personality in that way? If he was friendly or humble or easygoing or anything like that?
We have a couple of like infamous stories of him being a little cantankerous, especially at his job before this, where like the players weren't really up to snuff, and he like called one of the bassoonists like a weenie bassoonist or something.
Yeah.
But that's very possibly not real anyway.
Apocryphal.
But yeah, but no, I mean, we mostly have this like report of Bach as being like a very not that as a very professional guy. But yeah, as a real person, as like a how would he have gotten along with the pastor? I don't know. I know that the sermons were usually very long, like an hour, and the pews were typically filled up, especially during those years when Bach was there. It was the place to be. The Thomaskirche people were really really into going to that church, and I mean, I wonder if that was a combination of elements, not just about Bach, because like we've talked about before on this podcast, he was not that well known as a composer in his lifetime. He's more known as an organist, but the Thomaskirche choir was well known as being a good choir.
Mm-hmm.
Right. We'd think this church, it sounds like they'd have the best stuff. So you'd think that they'd probably have good preachers also, or at least competent ones. But I do wonder about that relationship. I don't know if you guys like at churches. It's very easy to get complex relationships, and
Oh yeah,
I mean, I've heard a pastor say before. He said, "I'd rather deal with terrorists than church musicians," which I don't know if that's. I
maybe
won't
a
say
little
who it
bit of
was.
hyperbole, but
Yeah, but just that it can be at the church. You obviously want to be gentle and humble and uplifting, but also you want excellence. So how do you balance those two?
that is
It's not always easy.
that is a great conundrum.
He must have got along well enough with the Leipzig staff because they allowed him to write so much music consistently for so long. That's at least my thought on that.
Yeah, but that is a thing that churches struggle with a lot, because you want to have like volunteers be a part of your musical ensembles, because you want to allow people in your church to express their talents to worship God, but then at the same time you want excellence, and you're going to have to spend money to hire pros sometimes, but then are you going to hire pros that are only like members of your church also? Because that's going to be really tricky. No, you probably hire pros from like instrumentalists from outside your church, and then they're not maybe a part of your church like culture. So there's always those little weird tensions with
Right.
church musicians and pastors. You know what I find really interesting is like the sort of side of it of the musical preaching of Bach, and how these pieces, they sometimes had scripture references. They sometimes had scripture just verbatim in them, but then a lot of them are like based on hymn tunes, and sometimes based on like poetry that Bach his collaborators would write for these cantatas and stuff. So I wonder, they must have been received well because he kept on doing that, right?
Right.
But
yeah.
But I wonder, well, like, how do you feel about this kind of thing as a pastor? Sometimes you are, I mean, probably very focused on correct doctrine and all that, as well as giving a meaningful and inspiring like message and making sure you preach the gospel and all that. Like, then what about the side of it of the music when it's not, or when it is, but also when it's not like jiving with that, or maybe it seems a little like not specific enough, or not, or maybe it just is not theologically good for you, and you're like, I don't know what to do about that, you know?
Yeah, well, I've definitely had to have those conversations before where some song came out and it was just not good theology, or just not good, like just sappy, or just not the right feel. Like, for instance, with Good Friday, you're going for a very specific feel and everything needs to be consistent.
Yeah.
And if you have a song that's not fitting in that feel, it's going to break the whole flow of the service.
Yeah.
So there have been times where I've had to, sit down and talk with a musician or music director and say, this just isn't the direction that we need to go, and it has to be unified. And sometimes it even has to be like, listen, I know this is your thing and this is what you'd like to do, but we have to unify it. We have to make it all point in the same direction. So maybe that's good for some point, but it's not good for right here. Although I feel like for the pastors who must have been with Bach, they could have said, hey, listen, you're going to set the tone and I'm going to match it. Because that can happen too. And if you know something's really good, you say, okay, I've heard this music and I know these words. I'm actually going to now match my sermon to what you've already started. And there have been times where I've been trying to write a sermon or convey something, and then I'll hear something in a hymn and it'll just be like one verse. And I'll say, wow, that one verse just captured what I was trying to capture in 10 minutes. And that is something I really enjoy with Bach, is the poetry and the feeling that he conveys. And a lot of times as pastors, we're trying to use stories and metaphors and all these things to capture these same ideas and not just preach to the mind, but to the heart.
Yeah.
But especially with Bach's music, with really good hymns, sometimes I'm just amazed that it can accomplish the same thing that we're trying to accomplish so much easier. Not easier, but so much more quickly.
Yeah, in terms of actual clock time.
Right.
Yeah.
Like if you want to talk about the delight of the Lord, you can use all these metaphors and stories. You can try to deconstruct it, but then you just hear this little melody, and it's like, oh, that's what delight is. Now I understand.
That is a great
delight.
point.
And
Yeah.
so sometimes when it happens, it can be a real joy as a pastor because you can just say, well, that's it. Or just remind people, hey, what we just experienced, that's it. That's what we're talking about. I just had it in a sermon this morning where there was a beautiful line, and it was actually in a praise song, but I said, well, think about that thing that we just said or that we just sang together, because that captures the same thing I'm trying to say.
Right, and the spirit of what they had just heard musically, was the emotion that you wanted to get to, probably.
Right.
And that's a great point. I watched a great video by Adam Neely, who's an amazing music content creator on YouTube. Does stuff about music a lot. He's very high quality stuff. And he did a TED Talk, I think it was, and it was about this very thing. And his point was why do we have musicians at weddings? Why do we have a band at a wedding or an organist or whatever? You don't just not have music at a wedding. That would be very weird.
Right.
And his point was what you're saying, which is that you need to experience the joy, you need to express that. You can't just tell somebody in words, be happy.
Right.
Or do you remember what it's like to feel happy? Because what that does is make them think intellectually about it.
Yeah.
And if you're delivering a really good sermon, I think you can get people emotionally into an emotional place. I'm not saying that you can't. Of course, you can really get there. But like Christian said, clock time, right?
Yeah.
Music can really just trigger that for you. And on the other hand, music's weakness is that it can't get into really specific things of communication like language can. You can't say a really complex sentence and make everybody feel the same thing in music. It has to be, it is very subjective. But when you can do something like this, like Jesu, joy of man is desiring, and I think this goes back to why it's so effective, it is so joyful and just so light and free and soul uplifting to so many people. It triggers that for so many people that it fulfills the purpose of music perfectly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And when paired with the words, you get the deeper thing also. And I guess that's what's so beautiful. And what do they say? You guys have probably heard this before. What are the two things Lutherans are supposed to do well? It's theology and music. And I think I've heard that's one of the ways they justified the gigantic new music and theology building they have at Concordia Irvine,
nice.
right?
Yeah.
But that's always been our specialty. And I think we would say, well, let's point to Martin Luther, one of the best theologians of all time. He's one of our guys. And let's point to Bach, maybe the greatest composer of all time.
Right.
And he's one of our guys. But those two things together, yeah, they powerfully hit both the intellect and the soul, the emotions, seat of emotions. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, music has that power that nothing else really has. And it's not a language. That's the thing, is that to get really picky about definitions, people use an inspiring phrase, music is a language, or music is the universal language, or
right.
whatever. And that is, I understand that idea, and I think that if we all understand what a person means when they say that, then that's fine. But music is also literally not a language. If you talk to a linguist, right? Because you're not communicating complex abstract thought. Communicating being the key word there through music. Music is the enrichment of the soul, and here you could be singing words, which makes it somewhere in between. But it's a more holistic experience than talking, I guess.
Yeah. According to Close Encounters of the Third Kind, though, it is a language, at least from what I remember.
Oh, yeah, I
If
guess
you're
it could
gonna
be.
if you're going to talk to aliens.
If you're going to talk to
Yes.
aliens.
I mean, I don't see why it couldn't be. It could also be a language. But then everyone have to agree on what
but right,
every
then you'd still
note
have to
means.
define it,
Yeah.
and you'd have to get into the same thing all language gets
Yeah,
into.
and just visualizing that, I think that would, if you had a language that really was made out of pitches and tones in our scale system and stuff like that, then it would stop being music.
Right.
It would not be music anymore. It would be a language,
to communicate
because it wouldn't
information.
be doing the function of music anymore. It would just be saying words.
Yeah.
Oh, that's deep.
And what it would be doing is it would be nailing down these certain pitches to certain concrete words and functions and stuff, and then it would not be subjective as music is anymore. It would kind of take all the flavor and interest out of music. That would be really sad. Let's
Right,
not
like
do that.
if a C minor chord meant chair, then that would be useful, but it would strip the C minor chord of its power to make us feel a certain way.
Yeah,
Right.
and in context with the C major chord that was just played before it, or in context with the F minor like key that you're in, or whatever. Like all those contexts are so important in music, and how the thing just leads you on. It's based on time, right? It's a temporal art, and so you'd lose all that, because now C minor would just mean chair. Anytime you played C minor or sang a C minor triad, arpeggiated or whatever, that'd be really sad for me.
Yeah, that would really be a different thing entirely.
And then on the other hand, you've got this perfect music by Bach, which is the exact reason why the subjective quality of music is still, even though it's subjective, it still manages to really tug at the heartstrings of most people that hear it.
Right. Well, it does. It communicates, but just in a different way, at a different level.
Right.
And gives that delight. Yeah, and it's interesting. Like that example at the beginning of a church service, when I hear that, and usually beginning of a church service, I don't know how you guys feel, but like I'm kind of stressed and I'm thinking about, okay, what are all the things I need to say at this point, at this point, at this point? How's everything going to flow together? All these things. And if someone just whispered to me like, hey, don't worry about it. Jesus loves you. Delight in the moment. I'd be like, oh, that's nice. Thank you for making me think that. But then I hear this and it just happens naturally.
It makes you feel that.
Right. And all of a sudden, all the other stuff kind of melts away, at least for a moment, and I get to enjoy it and be at peace and delight. It just happens. It's not even something I have to think about. It just happens.
It's the power of music.
And it's not, we said that it takes up maybe less clock time than speaking it, the same sentiment, but also music's power is to stretch and warp time to us too. Like you're saying, like you can think in the moment if you're listening to music, and that might not feel like that if you're just passing time silently. And like in the context of a worship service, having that music, even Eric, like you said, having an instrumental prelude be like someone playing Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring, can put you in a space momentarily that will set you up for the rest of the service. And that's just a moment for you, right. A moment of Bach, if you will.
How about that? Nice. So I just spent a bunch of time talking about how great the music and the melody is, but I'm actually only recently familiar with the actual words of the chorale, but they're great. So I guess this is part 6. It says, I am blessed to have Jesus, oh how firmly I hold him, that he might refresh my heart. When I am ill and sad, I have Jesus who loves me and entrusts himself to me. Oh, that is why I shall not leave Jesus, even though my heart should break. I'm going to be straight with you. That totally could be like a praise song, I think.
Yeah.
Like it's kind of got the same flavor. I don't know.
A lot of these, we've talked a little bit about this, but a lot of these texts from this time, it's very emotionalism driven, and it feels more at home with like contemporary Christian praise music than with the hymns we might call traditional nowadays.
The words do.
Not
the music.
Yeah,
the music
words.
sounds traditional. The words are often first person like this.
Yeah.
Right? And a lot of times, like in the Passions and the stuff where the libretto was composed, it actually kind of is rather emotional and uses love allegory. Like we've talked about the love duet in the Wacht auf cantata. And some people's opinion, it's like a little too much.
Yeah, like wedding stuff between the groom, Jesus, and the bride, his church. And the Wacht auf one uses text from Song of Solomon in there.
Yeah, that's
not
a little
the,
steamy.
Not the racier stuff, but it does use Song of Solomon in there, and it is not. I mean, these things go in phases with how the church feels about this stuff. And during this time, it was a little more acceptable to have this more emotional text.
Yeah, it was in fashion then, just like contemporary praise music, it's that kind of text is in fashion again. And listen to how different the one that you, the listener, might know, the English the English words for Jesu, joy of man's desiring, which by the way is completely different, like a different text.
Right.
And look at how old this sounds and completely unlike the Bach text that we were talking about, and also unlike the worship and praise music that we have contemporary stuff now. It goes, Jesu, joy of man's desiring, holy wisdom, love most bright, drawn by thee, our souls aspiring, soar to uncreated light. Word of God, our flesh that fashioned with the fire of life impassioned, striving still to truth unknown, soaring, dying round thy throne. It's sort of like as poetic, it's like maximum poetry. You know, it's like someone tried so hard to make it as luxuriously poetic as possible. It's very different than
absolutely. Then
the down-to-earth
He will
stuff.
refresh my heart when I'm ill and sad. I have Jesus who loves me.
Yeah, but you know what that sounds more like? The He will refresh my heart thing. It sounds more like the Psalms to me.
Absolutely.
You know? And a lot of the Psalms are very contemporary Christian music sounding in a way. I mean, that's kind of a comeback I like to bring up when people hate on that music, but I mean, it's not. There's issues that I have too, of course, and it's a whole complex thing. But
right, there's not enough enemies crushing me, and things like that, and bowls of Bashan and other stuff like that.
Yeah, it can be very easily watered down, this music, and we wouldn't want that to be in our church services if we're being honest with what we should be saying in worship. But yes, and there is that in these chorales. There is the darkness with the light, but you get.
Well, I really like part 10, which is the repeat part, right?
Yeah.
So that's really good. I think the first one's fine. It's okay, but the number 10 is really good.
Yeah.
Should I read it?
Sure.
Yeah.
All right. So this is the last part. Jesus remains my joy, the comfort and sap of my heart. Jesus wards off all suffering. He is the strength of my life, the joy and sun of my eyes, the treasure and bliss of my soul. Therefore, I shall not let Jesus out of my heart or sight. I feel like that's a little more powerful.
Yeah. And that must have been the kind of thing that these German audiences really spoke to them.
Right.
Yeah, and some of these like idioms probably don't translate perfectly into English. But it's interesting, you would never hear like the comfort and sap of my heart. It just doesn't seem like a very understandable thing to talk about. But I think we get what the author is trying to say there, right? Sap being like the sort of like lifeblood of the tree, right? Mm-hmm. Kind of like the very inside lifeblood of your soul, right? I think that's what I'm getting out of that.
Now, is the author for sure Bach?
Well, not of the text.
Not of the text. Okay.
Yeah, this particular, I have to look this up real quick.
Looks like the text was written by Salomo Frank, who was the Weimar court poet at the time when Bach wrote the first version of this cantata.
But the melody was known already.
Yeah, it would have been one of the hymns that they sang in church already.
Yeah. So listening to this as a congregant to this church, you would hear this melody that you recognized with a text that was new, along with the instrumental adorning of it that was also new.
Yeah, we still do stuff like this today. Sometimes I have a great friend and collaborator who's a brilliant author, whose name is Catherine Dubke, and she wrote a wonderful extra stanza for Great is Thy Faithfulness. And we used it and arranged it and the whole thing. And it became a good way to add a little bit of an extra dimension to some sort of worship service or setting or something like that. Cool.
That's super cool. I want to use it. You should tell me about it.
I'll send it to you.
That'd be great.
So something that's interesting is that we were talking about Bach's relationship with his pastors, and I think they're mostly good. But we do know of one situation where at the period of his life where he worked in Mühlhausen, where the pastor and Bach clashed a little bit, and the pastor wanted more simple music because Bach was really interested in weaving together some very interesting, complicated things, and this pastor wanted it to just be a lot more plain and simple. So I think he did run into stuff like that sometimes.
Well, it makes sense. I mean, a different vision of what it's going to be, and the pastor has one vision and he has another vision, and that happens sometimes, and you have to figure out, well, who's going to steer the ship. And it sounds like Bach, he left, so I guess the pastor ended up steering the ship. He got what he wanted. Bummer, man. He didn't know what he was missing out on.
Yeah, it's interesting with something like Bach where we now, from the comfort of the future, we know that he was consistently good in everything he wrote, so it's not like the problem someone has with him is that they didn't like his music. It was probably more like they thought it was too strange or complex or maybe stole the show, like we said, or something like that. But I think it can go in, that kind of conflict can go in a lot of different directions. Alex was mentioning Adam Neely. There's another Adam Neely video about praise music, and it's a review, and it's a really interesting argument from the outside of religion, coming from the outside and looking in and thinking like, well, why is it a tradition in some cases in worship music? Why is it a tradition to make sure that the music is simple? And why not glorify God by using all of your musical training and making things interestingly complex when the words or whatever calls for it, the themes do? And to that argument, Bach would be the best argument for that, which is just like, you can use all of your musical resources in the service of the church like Bach did without ever coming across as egotistical or full of yourself.
Right. Or pretentious or elitist. I know this was a problem around the time of Luther, and you guys probably know more about this than I do, but that a lot of times the congregation was purely an audience. In fact, all of the service, even some of the non-sung parts, was done between the choir and the priest. And actually the congregation wasn't involved at all. And it was kind of not done because, well, they can't sing that well. It's not going to sound that good, so forget about it. Let's just use the choir, and that's what we're going to focus on. In fact, I went to a very old-style Catholic service, and that was still the case. It was everything happened between the priest and the choir. Congregation said nothing.
Oh, interesting. That seems like a little bit of a shame because, I mean, it makes sense why that has to be the case for some people, but also it misses out completely on the power of congregational singing.
Right.
Which is really good for being a person who just shows up at a church service. It's really nice to be able to sing.
Well, that has to be the balance of accessible, like beautiful and wonderful and adorning, but also acceptable.
Right. You don't want it to just be a concert.
Right. Exactly.
Or seem like that. And then plus that gets back to the danger of the old days of leaving the congregation literally outside or literally outside of a screen while things happen in the altar, and it's like, well, the important people are doing stuff in Latin now, but I don't speak Latin, so I don't even understand what I'm looking at here.
Yeah, absolutely. The fine balance of beautiful yet accessible, and showcasing parts of that beauty, but also not leaving anybody behind. And I guess that's the balance you have to find.
Yeah.
So this all just reminds me of Bach's introduction that he wrote to the Orgelbuchlein, which is like just the perfect encapsulation of his philosophy about his work. And that is that it says, "To the glory of God alone in the highest, and for the edification of my neighbor."
Hey, that's good.
Pretty good little statement there.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, that's like, we talk about vocation. It's like, glory to God. He doesn't need your service, but do it to glorify him and help your neighbor out. He needs it.
Right, and the goal of a pastor, and you could tell me if I'm right here about this, since you're a pastor, when you're doing your sermon is like, you want to be edifying people, right? And the ultimate thing is like the preaching the gospel part of it, right?
Absolutely.
As far as being a Lutheran pastor, Christian pastor. And as a music person at a church, if you're in charge of music, that should also be the goal, even though you're not the pastor. It needs to be that too.
Yeah.
That Bach clearly knew that is a testament to his greatness, besides just how great he was at composing.
Right. And I've heard stories of people, and I think you guys have mentioned this before, who literally are brought to the faith through his music. I've heard people who knew nothing about Christianity. They heard his music, they learned more about what he was saying, and they came to faith through that, which is pretty incredible that he can use this medium to, again, convey that powerful of feelings. Yeah, it's beautiful. So,
yeah.
And now, here's the 10th movement of the cantata Herz und Mund und Tat und Leben, the chorale, beginning with the words, Jesus bleibet meine Freude, known to many of us as Jesu joy of man's desiring. If this introduction to a musical moment has inspired you to hear the rest of this cantata, please see the link in the episode description to see the performance. Do you want to hear our new episodes as we release them? Find us on your podcast app and hit subscribe. Please rate and review us on your podcast app, and check out our website, amomentofbach.com, and our Instagram and Facebook page. Eric, do you want to tell us about your podcast?
Sure. So I also host my own podcast, and it's called The Faithful Forebearers. And the whole purpose of my podcast is to each episode pick a different person in the history of the church and explain why their life was important and what we can learn from them, and to be uplifted by their stories and inspired. Currently, I'm going through a series on the Church of Ethiopia, which is a lot of fun. It's something I didn't know much about. The church has been part of Africa since the very beginning, and Ethiopia for at least 1,700 years, and what we can learn from the stories of many faithful men and women there. So you can check me out on my Facebook page, Faithful Forebears. My podcast is also available on podcast players, and pretty soon I'd love to have you two on. Actually, Christian, you've already been on my podcast once,
Yeah.
and we talked about Guillaume de Machaut, and that was once a lot of fun. So hopefully we will do that again. And the next one I want to have with you guys is going to be on the medieval Ethiopian composer Yared. I don't even know if I'm saying that right, but I'll figure out by the episode.
Neither do I. So, Eric, what was the name of your podcast again? Because I don't know anything about this podcast. What is this podcast all about?
The Faithful...
Can you tell?
Did I not say enough?
No, I'm just kidding.
No, he did.
There's a visual joke that's stupid on a podcast, but I'm wearing a Faithful Forebears t-shirt right now.
Oh,
So
yeah.
obviously, I know about Faithful Forebears.
Thanks. He does have a super cool t-shirt on. Thanks for wearing that.
Not
When are you
only-
guys getting some merch?
I don't know. We should.
Yeah, we don't
We have
any
a great
merch yet.
logo. As we said, we shouted out our artist, Sydney Lacombe. Great logo that she
We'll have
did.
to do that.
We'll have to do that.
Yeah.
So check out The Faithful Forebears. I just checked my t-shirt. That is right.
You got it. Nailed it.
So, Christian, which moment of Bach are we going to look at next week?
We're going to look at a moment from the cantata Der Herr denket an uns, BWV number 196.
Until next time, enjoy those moments.